My father raised his glass over our holiday dinner and declared the best gift would be if I vanished from this family. He believed he was merely insulting a daughter who never fit his perfect mold. He did not realize I held the keys to his estate, his grand charity gala, and his borrowed reputation. In exactly 24 hours, all of Charleston will finally learn who truly funds his illusions. My name is Madeline Ross, and I am 35 years old. Tonight, the air in Charleston carried the sharp bite of a coastal winter mixed with the heavy scent of blooming jasmine and salt water. The city was already draped in holiday lights, glowing brightly against the dark historical cobblestones. Wren Hall, the ancestral estate of the Ross family, stood at the end of the long driveway looking exactly like a vintage Christmas postcard. The grand white pillars were wrapped in thick garlands of fresh pine and imported velvet ribbons. Warm golden light poured from the tall arched windows onto the meticulously manicured lawns. I walked through the heavy oak front doors with a familiar, fragile hope resting in my chest every year. I told myself that this Christmas Eve dinner would be different. I told myself that tonight, my father would finally look at me and see a daughter, not an endless, unspoken obligation. I stepped into the grand dining room, letting the heavy mahogany doors close softly behind me. The space was a breathtaking monument to old Southern wealth and carefully curated prestige. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the painted ceiling, casting a shattered, brilliant light over the long dining table. Silver cutlery, polished to a flawless mirror finish, caught the reflection of dozens of flickering taper candles. The tablecloth was heavily embroidered silk, white and completely pristine. My father, Declan Ross, sat at the head of the table. He was the reigning king of this carefully constructed kingdom. He wore a tailored velvet dinner jacket, looking every inch the aristocratic patriarch he believed himself to be. He looked powerful, untouchable, and completely secure in his position. Dinner progressed with the usual hollow, exhausting conversations. They discussed commercial real estate acquisitions, exclusive country club memberships, and the upcoming charity gala that my father hosted every single year to solidify his social standing. I sat quietly at my designated place near the end of the table, absorbing the atmosphere, eating perfectly cooked lamb that tasted like nothing. Then, the porcelain dessert plates were cleared away by the silent serving staff. My father picked up his heavy silver spoon and tapped it sharply against his crystal wine glass. The clear ringing instantly silenced the entire room. Everyone turned their absolute attention to him. He stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing the lapels of his velvet jacket. He began his annual predictable speech about family honor. He spoke at length of the Ross legacy, the incredible weight of our name in the local community, and the vital importance of maintaining the highest possible standards in everything we do. His voice was smooth, practiced, and deeply arrogant. I watched his face, waiting for the moment he would acknowledge us all, perhaps even acknowledge me. Instead, his gaze drifted slowly down the long expanse of the table and locked directly onto my eyes. The artificial warmth in his expression vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, flat, undeniable disdain. He raised his glass slightly in my direction. The entire room held its breath, sensing the shift in the air. Then, he delivered the words with perfect, chilling clarity, cutting through the festive atmosphere like a butcher knife. He said the best gift for this family is for you to vanish. The silence that immediately followed was absolute and terrifying. It was heavy, suffocating, and thick enough to choke on. Not a single person at that table gasped. No one shifted uncomfortably in their expensive antique chairs. I looked slowly around the table, taking in the faces of the people who shared my blood. My younger brother, Beckett Ross, sat directly across from me. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk spread across his handsome, privileged face. He enjoyed the cruelty. He thrived on it. Beside my father, my stepmother Lenora simply lowered her head, staring intently at her empty china plate, choosing utter cowardice over a single word of confrontation. The extended relatives, The aunts and cousins, who happily drank the imported wine and ate the gourmet food, suddenly found the intricate grain of the mahogany table incredibly fascinating. Nobody defended me. Nobody even looked at me. To them, this sudden cruelty was just another acceptable part of the holiday tradition, the price of admission to Declan Ross and his elite circle. I did not cry. I did not stand up and scream in outrage. I did not offer them the cheap satisfaction of a visible emotional breakdown. Instead, I let my eyes wander around the magnificent room, taking a mental inventory. I looked at the massive crystal chandelier hanging above us. I looked at the beautifully upholstered antique chairs they sat on. I looked at the perfectly restored plaster molding along the high ceiling. They looked around and saw a permanent, untouchable family legacy. I looked around and saw nothing but my own receipts. Every single item in this room, every brick in the foundation of this house, was maintained by my money and my labor. The luxurious, careless lifestyle they wore like a second skin was completely funded by my corporate contracts, my quiet wire transfers, and my desperate, pathetic attempts to buy their basic affection. They casually called it temporary support. They treated my wealth and my relentless effort as their inherent right, a natural resource they could exploit without a single word of gratitude. The memories of their casual insults echoed loudly in my mind. They always spoke of my career with a barely concealed sneer. I built my company, Northline Continuity, from absolutely nothing. To them, my highly specialized work in corporate crisis management was just a dirty job cleaning up the messes of other people. They considered it a deeply unglamorous profession. It completely lacked the shiny prestige of commercial real estate development or high-profile socialite philanthropy. It was invisible work, dirty work, and completely beneath the grand, historical Ross name. They did not know, or deliberately chose to forget, the terrifying financial reality of the past 7 long years. Exactly 7 years ago, a massive coastal hurricane nearly wiped Wren Hall off the map, destroying the roof and flooding the lower levels. The banks absolutely refused to lend my father another single dime because he was already over-leveraged and drowning in hidden debts. Total bankruptcy was merely days away. I was the one who quietly stepped in while they panicked. I secretly restructured the massive debt to save the estate and protect my father from the ultimate, crushing humiliation in front of Charleston high society. Since that day, I had paid the exorbitant property taxes every single year. I had covered the massive, embarrassing deficits of their vanity charity foundation. I had personally guaranteed the commercial loans that kept this entire glittering illusion alive. Declan casually called it preserving our grand tradition. I called it a bleeding, infected wound that was slowly draining my life away. The silence in the dining room stretched on, taut and incredibly fragile. Then, Beckett leaned back in his chair, swirling his expensive amber bourbon in his glass. He looked at me with his signature, unearned arrogance, and decided to add a final, twisting blade to our father and his insult. He said, "You are best at disappearing when no one needs you anyway." A strange, powerful sensation washed over me in that exact second. It was not pain. It was not grief. It was absolute, crystalline clarity. The fragile, pathetic hope I had carried through the heavy front door finally shattered into a million pieces. But it did not hurt at all. It felt exactly like waking up from a long, suffocating, exhausting sleep. I looked at Beckett, then I looked down the table at my father, and finally, I smiled. It was a very slight, quiet, almost imperceptible smile. It was not a smile of surrender, and it was certainly not a smile of heartbreak. It was the terrifyingly calm smile of a forensic auditor who has just found the fatal, undeniable flaw in a set of deeply fraudulent corporate books. The emotional inventory was completely finished. The ledger was finally closed. They had absolutely no idea that they had just given me the exact permission I needed to stop saving their lives. I stood up slowly, deliberately pushing my chair back. The scrape of the heavy wood against the polished floor sounded remarkably loud in the dead silent room. I did not say a single word to any of them. I simply picked up my coat from the back of the chair and turned my back on the dining room, on my father, on Beckett, and on the pathetic illusion of my family. I walked down the long, silent hallway toward the back of the massive house. I passed through the grand catering kitchen. The hired staff had already left for the night, leaving the huge space pristine and gleaming under the harsh, bright overhead lights. I paused in front of the massive stainless steel refrigerator. Pinned to the center of the metal door beneath a heavy souvenir magnet was a glossy family portrait taken under the giant Christmas tree in the grand foyer last year. My father, Lenora, and Beckett stood dead center, dressed perfectly, beaming brightly at the camera. I was positioned on the far edge of the group, slightly out of focus, looking exactly like a hired stranger who had accidentally wandered into the frame of someone else and their perfect life. I stared at that glossy photograph for a long, quiet time. The massive house around me felt fundamentally different now. It no longer felt like a childhood home that was actively rejecting me. It felt exactly like a fragile stage set waiting to be violently struck down. The air in the kitchen was perfectly still. A new thought formed in my mind, cold and sharp as a newly forged steel blade. They stated clearly that they wanted me to vanish. They truly believed I was nothing but an embarrassing, awkward shadow in their brilliant, sunlit lives. They eagerly took my money, my endless time, and my desperate loyalty for 7 years, and they confidently offered me cruel exile in return. I reached out and traced the cold edge of the photograph with my index finger. The final decision settled deep into my bones, heavy, calm, and absolutely permanent. If they wanted me to vanish, I would give them exactly what they asked for. I would vanish completely. But I would vanish in a precise, calculated way that would completely dismantle their entire world. I would ruthlessly strip away the financial foundation I had secretly built for them. Piece by piece, dollar by dollar, contract by contract, I would leave them standing naked in the smoking ruins of their own blinding arrogance. They would remember my sudden disappearance for the rest of their miserable lives. I turned away from the photograph, my footsteps echoing lightly and quickly on the cold marble floor as I headed straight for the side exit. The crisp night air hit my face the second I opened the door, smelling sharply of salt and bitter winter. The festive, expensive holiday lights of Wren Hall twinkled brightly behind me in the dark, looking beautiful and completely hollow. Tomorrow was the 24th of December. Tomorrow, the grand illusion would finally end, and the real reckoning would begin. The tires of my car hummed a low, steady rhythm against the dark asphalt as I drove away from the towering iron gates of the estate. The harsh winter wind whipped against the windshield, but inside the cabin, the air was completely still. It is a very easy thing for outsiders to look at a woman in my position, a woman with independent wealth and a razor-sharp mind, and wonder why she endured such profound disrespect for so long. People who have grown up in healthy, supportive homes often assume that staying in an abusive dynamic is a sign of inherent weakness or a catastrophic lack of self-respect. They simply do not understand the intricate, suffocating mathematics of trying to earn the love of a parent who only speaks the language of utility. They do not comprehend the powerful, invisible chains forged by a desperate childhood need for approval. To understand why I stayed for so many years, you have to understand the massive void that was left behind when my biological mother, Elaine Ross, passed away. I was only 12 years old when a relentless, aggressive illness took her from us. Her death did not just remove a parent from our household, it completely destabilized the fragile emotional ecosystem of our family. My father, unable or unwilling to process his grief in a healthy manner, immediately filled the crushing silence by turning his absolute, unwavering devotion toward my younger brother. Beckett was the perfect golden child, molded precisely to fit the grand narrative of our supposed aristocracy. He possessed the exact brand of shallow charm required to navigate the treacherous waters of high society. He knew the right handshakes, he flashed the perfect rehearsed smiles for the cameras, and he wore the heavy mantle of the future heir with an effortless, breathtaking arrogance. He was exactly what a man like my father wanted to present to the world. I, on the other hand, was fundamentally different. I lacked the smooth, polished veneer that was expected of a daughter in our elite circle. I was a creature of sharp edges, silent observation, and an unsettling intensity. While my brother was meticulously groomed to charm wealthy donors at country club luncheons, I was left entirely to my own devices. I learned very early on that I would never be the beautiful, agreeable daughter who could dazzle a room filled with judging socialites. So, I became something else entirely. I became the woman you called when your perfectly constructed world was suddenly burning down to the ground. Through sheer willpower and an innate, almost clinical understanding of systems and structures, I built my career. I developed a unique ability to look at a collapsing financial entity, strip away the panic, and find the hidden arteries that were bleeding out. I knew exactly how to negotiate ruthlessly with predatory lenders. I knew how to patch massive corporate wounds and silently erase the disastrous, embarrassing mistakes made by careless, powerful men. I was highly effective, deeply respected in my field, and entirely invisible to the people who shared my blood. The defining tragedy of my relationship with my family was that I allowed them to exploit this exact skill set under the guise of familial duty. When the massive coastal storms ravaged our properties years ago, the structural damage was horrific, but the financial devastation was a fatal blow. The banks, well aware of the hidden debts my father had accumulated over decades of reckless spending, laughed him right out of their mahogany boardrooms. His immense pride was completely shattered. He was absolutely terrified of the impending public humiliation. He could not bear the thought of his wealthy peers watching his empire crumble into dust. I stepped directly into that desperate, gaping void. I utilized the corporate entity I had built from absolutely nothing to construct a complex, airtight financial bridge. I shielded his fragile ego from the judging eyes of the community. I vividly remember the night we finalized the rescue. We were standing in the quiet darkness of his private study. He looked at me with an expression that I foolishly, desperately mistook for genuine respect. He placed his hands on my shoulders and promised me that my massive financial intervention was merely a temporary phase. He swore, looking directly into my eyes, that once the dust settled and the properties were stabilized, he would officially integrate me into the family enterprise. He promised me a title, a seat at the main table, and the authority that reflected my true, undeniable value. That single, beautiful promise was the lie I fed myself for thousands of days. I waited patiently for the promotion that was supposedly right around the corner. I waited for the public acknowledgement of my sacrifice. Instead, the seasons changed. The years bled into one another, and my role within the family solidified into something much darker and far more parasitic. I was never brought into the light. I was kept permanently in the basement of our grand legacy. My phone only rang when a massive vendor bill was dangerously overdue, when the property taxes threatened to trigger a state audit, or when a catastrophic public relations crisis caused by my brother needed an invisible hand to smother it before it reached the press. Meanwhile, the family machinery worked relentlessly to manufacture a brilliant, entirely fictional narrative for my brother. Beckett became the shining, heroic public face of our supposed resilience. The absolute audacity of it still astounds me. I watched him pose for glossy, multi-page spreads in exclusive local lifestyle magazines. I watched him stand confidently at podiums during massive charity galas, captivating wealthy audiences with inspiring tales of how he personally spearheaded the grand renaissance of our ancestral home. He eagerly accepted prestigious community awards and thundering applause for the structural integrity of a building he did not pay a single cent to save. During every single one of those events, I sat in the shadowy corners of the ballrooms. I listened to his stolen speeches. I swallowed the bitter, metallic taste of betrayal, pushing it deep down into my stomach. I operated under a profound, sickening delusion. I managed to convince myself that my relentless, agonizing usefulness would eventually transform into genuine parental love. I believed, with the desperate naivety of a frightened child, that one day my father would stand before our peers, point to me, and declare that I was the sole reason the walls of our legacy had not collapsed. Tonight, the brutal reality finally shattered that pathetic fantasy into unrecognizable dust. The words my father spoke at the dinner table were not a slip of the tongue caused by holiday stress or too much wine. They were a profound, chilling revelation of his core, unshakable belief. In the cold, calculating mind of the man who raised me, I was never a daughter to be cherished or protected. I was simply a resource. I was an unlimited credit line attached to a pulse. I was a utility to be drained completely dry, and then casually discarded the exact moment my physical presence became an uncomfortable reminder of their own incompetence. This is exactly why the retribution I'm about to unleash upon them is not born from a sudden, chaotic burst of hysterical anger. A crime of passion is always sloppy. It leaves messy evidence. It stems from a heart that still fundamentally cares about the people it is striking out against. My heart completely stopped caring the moment he raised his crystal glass to wish for my total erasure. The decision to systematically dismantle the empire they so proudly flaunt is the final, completely logical conclusion of a comprehensive audit that has lasted for nearly a decade. It is a carefully prepared termination of a heavily one-sided contract. As I navigate the dark, winding coastal roads toward the city limits, I am not crying. There are no tears blurring my vision. My hands are perfectly steady on the leather steering wheel. I am approaching their destruction with the chilling, absolute calmness of a woman who has finally recognized her own worth, and who knows exactly how to collect every single debt she is owed. The ledger is open, the balance is due, and I will not accept partial payment. I did not walk straight to the driveway. The grandfather clock in the main hallway struck 11 times, its deep brass chimes echoing through the silent, cavernous space. It was the late evening of the 23rd of December. The rest of the family had retreated to their sprawling bedroom suites, utterly exhausted by the heavy labor of eating expensive food and mocking my existence. I turned down the narrow, dimly lit corridor that led to the old library annex. This was my designated space, a cold, windowless room tucked away in the back wing, so the sound of my late-night overseas conference calls would never disturb their precious sleep. I unlocked the heavy oak door, stepped inside, and turned on the small brass desk lamp. I sat down in the leather chair, opened my laptop, and bypassed the standard family network to access my heavily encrypted private server. For 7 long years, I had meticulously maintained a shadow architecture of this entire estate. I opened the master directory. The screen cast a harsh, unforgiving blue light across my face as I stared at the folders. Debt schedules, vendor agreements, guarantor forms, property tax receipts, and commercial promissory notes. I opened the primary aggregate spreadsheet. The sheer volume of the numbers, when calculated into one final column, was staggering. It is one thing to quietly pay an invoice here and quietly settle a legal dispute there. It is a completely different kind of nightmare to see the absolute total of my bleeding loyalty staring back at me. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had quietly bled into millions. What made me pause, bringing a chilling calmness to my chest, was not the massive sum of money. It was the sudden, crystal-clear realization of my absolute operational chokehold over the upcoming events. The grand Christmas Eve gala, the crown jewel of my father and his social empire, was less than 24 hours away. The entire magnificent production relied on a fragile web of independent local vendors. Every single one of those luxury providers required an aggressive upfront deposit and a corporate guarantor. Because my father had entirely destroyed his own credit decades ago, my signature sat at the absolute bottom of every single contract. I did not act out of frantic anger. My movements were slow, methodical, and surgically precise. I opened the private banking portal and began pulling the safety pins out of their perfect, glittering grenade. First, I navigated to the commercial floral vendor. I canceled the final wire transfer for the imported winter orchids and the fresh pine garlands, revoking all payment authorizations effective immediately. Next, I opened the account for the luxury lighting contractor responsible for the extravagant facade illumination. A single click of my mouse terminated the service agreement for an immediate breach of payment terms. I moved relentlessly down the list. I targeted the high-end transportation logistics company. The entire fleet of luxury black vehicles scheduled to ferry their wealthy VIP guests from the downtown boutique hotels, was instantly canceled. I logged directly into the proprietary event management software. I changed the administrative passwords, securely locked the servers, and completely blinded the family to the digital guest list. They would not be able to confirm a single arrival or seat a single donor. Then, I turned my attention to my brother. I accessed the private corporate dashboard and located the 3 platinum credit accounts Beckett treated as his personal, unlimited wallets. These were the cards he used to buy his expensive designer suits, his lavish dinners, and the quiet loyalty of his high society friends. I froze all 3 accounts instantly, flagging them for unauthorized administrative usage. The digital locks clicked into place, one by one, sealing the vault. This was not a petulant act of vandalism. I was not throwing a childlike tantrum or destroying their precious home. I was simply letting the natural laws of gravity do their inevitable work. The most profound, dangerous secret of the Ross family was buried deep inside the county property records. My father strutted through the grand halls of Wren Hall, firmly believing he was the undisputed master of his domain. He held the historical, decorative deed to the land. But that piece of paper was entirely encumbered by a massive, aggressive preservation lien. When the commercial banks had completely abandoned him after the hurricane, my private holding company, M.R. Winter Holdings, had quietly purchased his toxic debt. I held the senior financial position. I controlled the operational covenant. If my holding company withdrew its standing waiver of default, the entire property would instantly fall into commercial receivership. The Ross family firmly believed they were standing proudly on impenetrable, historical rock. In reality, they were standing on a fragile, temporary wooden bridge that I had personally engineered. Tonight, I was simply walking away and taking the structural support beams with me. I let the legal reality revert to its true, terrifying state. I opened a blank document on my laptop. I decided to compile a single, brutal page of text. It was a highly summarized, undeniable ledger of my absolute sacrifice. I listed the delinquent county property taxes I had cleared to prevent foreclosure. I listed the premium hazard insurance policies I had fully funded. I documented the massive structural roof repairs. I included the quiet, out-of-court financial settlements I had arranged to cover up the reckless, embarrassing indiscretions of my brother. I logged the exact operational deficits I had covered to keep their vanity charity foundation afloat. At the very bottom of the page, I typed the final, staggering sum. It was a number so violently large it would force all the air from the lungs of anyone who read it. I routed the document to the small wireless printer sitting on the wooden credenza. The machine whirred to life, breaking the heavy silence of the room, and spat out a crisp white sheet of paper. I took the page, folded it sharply in half, shut down my laptop, and walked out of the study. The house was completely dark now, wrapped in a thick, expensive, ignorant silence. I made my way back to the sprawling catering kitchen. I stepped up to the massive stainless steel refrigerator. Right below their glossy, perfectly staged family Christmas Eve greeting card. I placed the printed ledger against the cold metal door and secured it with a heavy magnet. I took a thick black marker from the marble counter. I did not write a long, emotional letter. I did not demand an apology. I simply wrote one short, definitive sentence across the bottom of the page. You asked me to vanish. Effective immediately. I left the marker on the counter. I walked out the side door and stepped into the biting winter air. The grand estate loomed silently behind me, a beautifully decorated, hollow shell completely unaware that its life support system had just been surgically severed. I walked to my car and started the engine. I did not pack any heavy luggage. I did not leave a forwarding address. I did not call a single person. As I drove down the long, winding driveway toward the sleeping city, the passenger seat was empty, but I carried something infinitely heavier than physical baggage. I carried the absolute, undeniable proof that the prestigious Ross family had been living a desperate, pathetic lie. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise, and they would finally wake up to the true cost of my absence. The morning of the 24th of December broke over the Charleston harbor in strokes of pale gold and bruised purple. I woke up in a room that did not belong to my family. It was a modest suite in a quiet boutique hotel, tucked away on a cobblestone side street near the water. The space was small, sparsely decorated, and completely devoid of antique mahogany or heavy crystal chandeliers. For the first time in an entire decade, I was waking up in a bed I had paid for exclusively for myself, not as a byproduct of housing someone else. There was no urgent knocking at my heavy oak door. There were no panicked, entitled demands echoing down a grand hallway. There was only the sound of seagulls and the gentle lapping of the tide against the distant wooden piers. I breathed in the cool air coming through the cracked window, and my chest felt miraculously light. I poured a cup of black coffee from the small machine on the granite counter and opened my laptop. The digital dominoes I had tipped over the night before were already crashing into each other with spectacular speed. My screen was filled with automated administrative notifications, a beautiful chronological symphony of their sudden ruin. I did not need to be standing in the grand foyer to see the absolute panic setting in. The data told the entire story. At exactly 7:30 in the morning, my father attempted to use his platinum card to authorize the premium catering staff for the evening gala. The transaction was instantly declined. I could perfectly picture the dark flush of indignation creeping up his neck as he handed the card back to his assistant, angrily assuming it was a ridiculous bank error. 10 minutes later, the first real, undeniable crack appeared in the facade. The premium wine merchant, a man who had tolerated my father and his condescending tone for years only because my holding company personally guaranteed the massive invoices, sent an urgent, aggressive email. The master contract was void. He demanded immediate payment in full via wire transfer, or he was recalling the entire holiday delivery truck halfway to the estate. By 8:15, the commercial florist was a confirmed no-show. The digital guest verification system I had built from scratch was completely dark, locking the event planners out of their own seating charts. My phone buzzed constantly on the nightstand, vibrating against the wood like a trapped insect. It was a frantic, misspelled text message from my brother, completely ignoring the final manifesto I had left on the refrigerator. He furiously demanded to know why his luxury sport utility vehicle was flashing a critical overdue payment warning on the digital dashboard and refusing to start the engine. The elite concierge service he used to book his lavish lifestyle and secure last-minute reservations had formally suspended his account. I did not reply. A moment later, my screen lit up with a furious social media update from his influencer girlfriend. She was standing in the grand foyer of Wren Hall, recording a live video for her hundreds of thousands of followers. She complained bitterly that the exclusive holiday preview event was a complete, embarrassing disaster, with no serving staff, no decorative lighting, and absolutely no way to verify the wealthy attendees gathering at the front gates. My father undoubtedly believed I was simply throwing a massive, hysterical tantrum. He thought I was hiding out in a cheap motel, waiting for him to summon me back with a half-hearted, hollow apology so I could magically fix the mess and restore his perfect world. He fundamentally misunderstood the gravity of the situation until exactly 9 o'clock. That was when the senior vice president of his commercial bank called his private line directly. My lawyer, Marin Holt, immediately forwarded me the corresponding legal notices. The massive bridge loan fee that kept the sprawling estate out of immediate foreclosure was suddenly missing its corporate guarantor. The bank demanded a full written explanation and an immediate deposit of liquid funds by the close of business today. My father had absolutely no liquid funds. His entire existence was a carefully balanced, terrifyingly fragile ledger of borrowed prestige. Then came the pathetic voicemail from my stepmother. Lenora never called me unless someone was actively dying or a massive, threatening bill was due. I pressed play and listened to the digital recording while staring out at the harbor boats. Her voice was dripping with a rare, highly manufactured sweetness that made my stomach turn. She begged me to please come home and stop being so incredibly dramatic, completely dismissing the reality that their entire world was currently burning to the ground. She said my father was just under a lot of holiday stress and did not mean what he said. I deleted the message before she even finished her sentence. 5 minutes later, Marin Holt sent an official, aggressively worded cease and desist email to the entire family, formally instructing them that all future communication must be routed exclusively through her legal office. The steel door was officially shut and securely locked. At 10:30, I left the quiet hotel room and walked down the street to a private dining room in a high-end seaside restaurant. I was not meeting with a corporate crisis management client. I was meeting with the executive board of the Bellwether House Collective. They were a powerful, highly successful hospitality group entirely owned and operated by women. 2 years ago, they had approached my father with a very generous, extremely fair offer to purchase Wren Hall. They saw the historical, architectural value of the property and wanted to preserve it. My father had humiliated their chief executive officer in the middle of a crowded, elite country club dining room. He laughed directly in her face, loudly declaring that a group of corporate women could never possibly understand the deep, refined nuances of Southern tradition. He told her the Ross family legacy was not for sale to a bunch of glorified hotel maids. He was dead wrong. The legacy was not his to sell in the first place. It was mine to give away. I sat across from the exact same chief executive officer he had publicly insulted. She wore a sharp-tailored suit and pushed a thick, beautifully bound memorandum of understanding across the polished mahogany table. I picked up my heavy silver pen. We were not just executing a standard real estate transaction. The Bellwether House Collective did not simply want to buy a grand historical mansion to turn a quick corporate profit. They wanted to capture the very soul of the property and completely reinvent its fundamental purpose. Their master plan was breathtaking in its scope and absolute poetic justice. They were going to transform Wren Hall into a premier leadership retreat and an intensive educational incubator for female entrepreneurs. The grand dining room, where my father had casually demanded my erasure, would become a state-of-the-art boardroom where women learned how to negotiate aggressive corporate takeovers. The sprawling, perfectly manicured lawns where my brother threw his arrogant, wildly wasteful parties would host annual scholarship galas, funding the absolute brightest minds of the next generation of female business leaders. I carefully reviewed the final terms of the transfer. This was the ultimate, devastating twist of the knife. I realized in that quiet, sunlit room that I was not merely walking away from a profoundly toxic family dynamic. Running away is an act of basic survival, but what I was doing was an act of total, undeniable alchemy. I was actively ripping their most prized asset, their absolute symbol of unearned power, right out of their greedy hands. I was taking the grand stage they used to flaunt their imaginary superiority and handing it over to the exact demographic my father had mocked and dismissed. I was turning a monument to male vanity into an impenetrable fortress of female empowerment. This was the deepest, most permanent blow I could possibly strike. My father could survive losing his money. He could eventually charm another desperate bank or swindle another gullible investor. But he could never survive the sheer, crippling public humiliation of losing his ancestral home to a group of women he deemed inferior, and he certainly could not survive knowing his own discarded daughter was the sole architect of his total ruin. I signed my name at the absolute bottom of the memorandum, the black ink flowing smooth and dark against the crisp white paper. I handed the heavy document back across the table. The executive smiled, a sharp, deeply knowing expression that perfectly mirrored my own internal peace. The estate was officially out of my hands, and the family name was officially out of time. The Grand Ross legacy was dead, and I had never felt more alive. The elite circles of Charleston operate on a very specific currency, and it is not just money, it is reputation. When you back a powerful man into a corner, he does not reflect on his past mistakes. He does not reach out with a genuine apology. He immediately relies on the exact tactic that has protected his kind for generations. He goes on the offensive, and he weaponizes public opinion. By noon on the 24th of December, the narrative had been completely rewritten. My father did not admit to his sudden financial ruin. Instead, he began aggressively planting seeds within the local media and his wealthy social clubs. He painted a tragic, highly compelling picture of an unstable, deeply bitter daughter who was consumed by an unnatural jealousy of her younger brother. He framed my departure not as a calculated financial withdrawal, but as a chaotic, greedy temper tantrum designed to extort the family. Beckett, always eager to play the victim, took the performance to an entirely new level. He uploaded a perfectly lit, highly edited video to his social media platforms. He looked directly into the camera lens with wide, sorrowful eyes. He spoke in a soft, trembling voice about how much the family loved me, claiming I was suffering a severe mental health crisis right in the middle of the holiday season. He asked his hundreds of thousands of followers for their prayers and understanding during this incredibly difficult time, masterfully shifting the local sympathy entirely to his side. His comment section quickly became a toxic echo chamber of strangers who had never met me, yet felt entirely justified in diagnosing my mental state and condemning my supposed cruelty. Meanwhile, Lenora was working the private phone lines. She systematically called the wives of bank executives, the chairs of the local hospital board, and the wealthy widows who funded the city arts programs. Her voice dripped with fake, whispered concern as she spread the toxic rumor that I had maliciously stolen their luxury vendors. She told anyone who would listen that I was actively threatening to destroy a massive charity event meant to benefit underprivileged children. It was a brilliant, vicious twist of the truth. They were actively transforming the victim of their lifelong exploitation into a cartoonish villain. I sat in my quiet hotel room, watching the digital assassination of my character unfold on my laptop screen. It was an impressive, coordinated strike. However, my silent observation was interrupted by my ringing phone. The caller identification displayed a name I did not expect to see. It was Inez Porter. Inez had been the head housekeeper at the estate for over 2 decades. She was a quiet, fiercely observant woman who knew every single secret buried within those massive walls. I answered the call, and her voice was tight with a mixture of anger and urgency. She told me Lenora had just fired her and ordered her off the property without severance. When I asked her why, Inez let out a dry, bitter laugh. She explained that while Lenora was screaming at the remaining staff about the canceled vendors, Inez had simply stated out loud that I was the only person keeping that massive house from collapsing into the dirt. That one single sentence of absolute truth cost her a job she had held for 20 years. But Inez did not call just to complain about her sudden termination. She told me she had something extremely important to give me, something she had secured from the private office of my father before she was escorted out of the building. We agreed to meet immediately at a small, entirely empty coffee shop a few blocks from the waterfront. When I arrived, Inez was sitting in a corner booth, clutching a thick brown envelope. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She slid the heavy package across the table. She explained that she had always known the combination to the hidden wall safe behind the oil painting in the study. She told me she saw my father hastily shoving files into it earlier that morning, looking genuinely terrified. When he left the room to handle a phone call from his lawyers, she opened the safe and made copies of the most prominent documents. I opened the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of papers. The ambient noise of the coffee shop faded into total silence as my eyes scanned the first few pages. What I saw fundamentally shifted the entire landscape of my retaliation. The first document was a heavily fabricated invoice. It detailed a massive, deeply expensive renovation for a luxury private boathouse on a lake property my father secretly owned in a neighboring county. The horrifying part was not the renovation itself. It was the fact that the entire expense had been explicitly charged against the Family Charity Foundation, falsely categorized as a structural upgrade for an underprivileged youth summer camp. It was a blatant, highly illegal misappropriation of donor funds. I kept reading, my breath growing shallow. There were falsified board meeting minutes, documenting unanimous financial decisions for the charity that had never actually taken place, but the final set of papers made my blood run entirely cold. I stared at a thick stack of commercial loan applications and aggressive tax deferment requests. At the bottom of every single page, resting on the signature line, was a perfect digital replica of my corporate electronic signature. The electronic signature was not a clumsy fake. It was a precise, high-resolution image lifted directly from a previous legitimate contract I had signed years ago. He had meticulously copied it, pasting it onto binding legal agreements that tied my personal holding company to millions of dollars in hidden toxic liabilities. I had never seen these documents before in my life. I had never authorized these specific loans. I had never agreed to these deferments. My father had not just been exploiting my actual wealth. He had actively stolen my legal identity. He had used my pristine corporate name and my flawless credit rating as a bulletproof vest to shield his own massive, fraudulent spending. A violent tremor started in my hands. I placed the papers face down on the table and pressed my palms flat against the cool wood to force the shaking to stop. The reality of the situation crashed over me with crushing weight. This was no longer just a pathetic story of a family of wealthy parasites draining a willing host. This was highly coordinated, deeply malicious financial fraud. If these toxic loans defaulted, or if the federal tax authorities ever audited the charity foundation, my father would not take the fall. The digital paper trail was meticulously designed to point directly and exclusively at me. I was the designated scapegoat for his potential prison sentence. I looked up at Inez. I thanked her. My voice barely above a whisper but laced with an undeniable, sharp edge. I promised her she would be fully compensated for her incredible loyalty and bravery. She simply nodded, gathered her coat, and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving me alone with the blueprint of my own framed destruction. I immediately contacted Maren Holt. I did not send an email. I called her directly and demanded she come to my hotel room at once. When she arrived, I laid the copied documents out on the bed. My lawyer, a woman who had seen the absolute worst of corporate greed, visibly paled as she reviewed the forged signatures and the fake charity invoices. She immediately contacted a private forensic accounting firm we kept on retainer. She instructed them to begin a deep, rapid trace on the boathouse renovation funds, mapping exactly how the money moved from the charity accounts into my father and his hidden private shell companies. As I watched Maren furiously typing on her secure laptop, drafting emergency legal injunctions, a profound shift occurred deep within my chest. The original plan I had formed the night before seemed entirely insufficient now. My goal was no longer to simply walk away with my head held high and let the estate crumble quietly into foreclosure. Walking away was what a victim did, and I was absolutely done being a victim. My father was spending the afternoon convincing the entire city that I was a crazy, vindictive woman trying to ruin his beautiful holiday tradition. He firmly believed that if he could just survive this one single night, if he could just host his glamorous Christmas Eve gala and dazzle his wealthy friends, he would maintain his iron grip on his precious social power. He thought the fake smiles, the expensive champagne, and the loud music would drown out the truth. I decided right then that I would not let the authorities handle this quietly behind closed doors. I wanted the truth to be exposed in the most excruciating, public manner possible. I wanted the revelation to happen at the exact moment he felt the most secure, the most powerful, and the most triumphant. I was going to let him put on his expensive tuxedo. I was going to let him welcome the absolute wealthiest, most influential people in Charleston into that grand foyer. I was going to let him stand under the massive crystal chandelier and raise his glass to his own fabricated brilliance. And then, right in the middle of his glorious, perfect evening, I was going to burn his entire legacy to the ground. Maren Holt sat at the small glass desk in the corner of my hotel room. She was typing furiously, building the aggressive legal defense we would need to counter the massive fraud my father had committed against my corporate entities. The loud, sharp clacking of her keyboard filled the quiet space, creating a chaotic rhythm that contrasted sharply with the profound stillness settling inside my own chest. I sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed. Resting beside my hands was a small, intricately carved cedar box. Inez had gently pressed it into my hands right before we left the small coffee shop earlier today. She told me she had found it hidden deep inside a forgotten storage closet in the old west wing of the estate. It was the room that used to belong to my mother, a space my father had ordered locked and untouched for over 2 decades. I reached out and slowly lifted the tarnished brass latch. The hinges creaked softly. The distinct scent of dried lavender and old, fragile paper immediately drifted up into the air, instantly transporting me back to my childhood. Inside the dark wooden box was a neat, thick stack of sealed envelopes. They were addressed to me in the elegant, sweeping handwriting of my mother. I carefully picked up the stack and noticed the dates written in the top right corners. They were written every single December leading up to her death. These were annual Christmas letters she had meticulously composed but never managed to give me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the first envelope. The paper was dry and brittle against my fingers. I read her words, hearing her soft, steady voice echoing in my mind for the first time in 23 years. The first few letters were filled with gentle holiday wishes, profound apologies for being confined to her bed, and beautiful expressions of her deep love for me. Then I reached the final envelope at the very bottom of the stack. It was dated just 3 weeks before her passing. The ink on the page was slightly smudged in several places, as if her hand had been shaking violently or tears had fallen onto the paper while she was writing. My eyes scanned the paragraphs quickly until they locked onto one specific, devastating paragraph. My breath caught sharply in my throat, freezing my lungs. She wrote that the men in the Ross family possess a unique, quiet, and highly toxic poison. She warned me, with the desperate clarity of a woman who knew she was dying, that they have a terrifying habit of finding the strongest woman in the room. Once they find her, they slowly and methodically convince her that her existence is only tolerated as long as she remains useful to them. She wrote that they will meticulously train you to believe that genuine affection and basic human respect are rare luxuries you must constantly purchase through endless, exhausting service. Reading those exact words felt like a heavy, rusted iron key turning violently inside a locked vault deep within my chest. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. The thick, confusing fog that had blanketed my entire adult life was instantly blown away. That single, profound paragraph perfectly explained the suffocating psychological trap I had lived in for so many years. I finally understood exactly why I had stayed. I understood why I had quietly paid every single overdue invoice for a massive estate I did not live in. I understood why I had constantly forgiven their cruel, cutting remarks at family gatherings. I understood why I had built a massive, highly successful corporate structure just to act as a secret financial bridge to keep their luxurious roof from caving in on their heads. I was not just a smart businesswoman protecting a historical building from foreclosure. I was a terrified, deeply lonely child, desperately trying to buy my way into the affection of my own family. I had truly, deeply believed that if I saved them from total destruction enough times, they would eventually look at me across the dinner table and decide I was finally worthy of being called a daughter. I slowly stood up, leaving the letters on the bed, and walked over to the large glass window. I looked out over the dark, churning waters of the Charleston harbor. Dozens of small sailboats bobbed aggressively against the wooden docks, tethered by thick, frayed ropes, fighting against the harsh winter wind. For the very first time since my father raised his crystal glass and told me to vanish, the crushing, monumental weight of everything I had endured finally broke through my rigid, professional composure. I leaned my forehead against the cold, smooth glass, and I began to cry. I did not cry out of sudden anger. I did not cry because they had humiliated me in front of our extended relatives, or because my brother was actively dragging my professional reputation through the mud on local television networks. I cried because my mother had accurately predicted my tragic, lonely future before I had even lived a single day of it. I cried because I finally realized the breathtaking, vast scale of my own isolation. I had spent thousands of days fighting a brutal, exhausting financial war to protect people who were perfectly comfortable watching me bleed to death on their perfectly manicured lawns. The tears fell completely silently, tracing hot, stinging paths down my cheeks and dripping onto my silk collar. But as I stood there watching the dark water fight the wooden piers, a profound, undeniable transformation occurred within my soul. This sudden, overwhelming release of sorrow did not weaken my resolve in the slightest. It did exactly the opposite. The hot tears washed away the very last lingering traces of my manufactured guilt. The deeply ingrained sense of obligation to my bloodline completely evaporated into the cold air. If I had to entirely shatter the pristine, untouchable reputation of the Grand Ross name to save my own soul, I would do it without a single second of hesitation. I would tear down their glorious pillars. I would not look back. I would not offer them a life raft when the floodwaters finally rose. Behind me, the rapid, chaotic typing suddenly stopped. Marin let out a low, sharp whistle of sheer disbelief that echoed loudly in the quiet hotel room. I wiped my face carefully with the back of my hand, smoothed the front of my shirt, and turned around to face her. She spun her silver laptop around so I could clearly see the bright screen. She had just managed to bypass a series of secure firewalls to gain direct access to the county land registry and the closed corporate filing networks. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, and told me the news was exponentially better than we could have ever anticipated. Marin explained that the legal chain of custody regarding the property deeds of the estate was absolutely bulletproof. The massive preservation lien held by my company was not just a background technicality hidden in the fine print. It was the absolute, dominating legal authority over the entire Wren Hall property. The digitized county records clearly proved that my father had gone to extraordinary, highly illegal lengths to actively conceal this crushing reality from his board of directors, his wealthy philanthropic donors, and his elite high society friends. He had filed dozens of fraudulent secondary financial disclosures to make it legally appear as though he still owned the historic estate outright and free of all debt. He had built his entire arrogant, commanding public identity on a foundation of aggressive, repeated perjury, and I held the only lit match that could burn his massive house of cards to the ground. The final, brilliant piece of the puzzle slid effortlessly into its designated place, the grand charity gala, the shining crown jewel of his social calendar, was scheduled to begin in just a few short hours. I made a silent, concrete, terrifyingly clear decision right then and there. I would not send a standard legal notice through the mail tomorrow morning. I would not hide safely behind Marin and her intimidating corporate briefcases. I was going to walk directly into the beating heart of his precious Christmas Eve. I would not enter that brilliantly lit, heavily decorated ballroom as a rejected, heartbroken child, begging her father to finally see her. I would walk through those massive oak doors as the only legitimate, legally recognized authority in the entire building. I was the absolute owner of the ground they stood on. I was the one single woman who possessed the undisputed right to completely terminate the pathetic, glittering charade of the untouchable Ross dynasty. I walked back over to the bed. I carefully gathered the brittle pages of the letters, folded them perfectly along their original creases, and placed them gently back inside the carved cedar box. I closed the heavy brass latch. It secured with a soft, definitive click that sounded like a heavy vault locking shut. I placed my right hand flat against the warm wood of the lid. I made a silent, unbreakable promise to the mother who had tried so desperately to warn me. The final devastating blow I was going to deliver tonight would do far more than just publicly humiliate the arrogant men who had actively stolen my financial identity. It would not just expose their massive, coordinated financial crimes to the absolute wealthiest elite of Charleston. This final, calculated strike was going to forcefully return everything they had stolen from my life. It was going to hand me back the decades I had completely wasted acting as an invisible human shield for their fragile, massive egos. Tonight, I was not just tearing down a corrupt, parasitic family. I was taking my own entire life back, and I was going to make absolutely certain that they watched me do it. The media machine of the Charleston elite is a terrifying, highly efficient monster when it is properly motivated. By 2:00 in the afternoon, my father had aggressively seized complete control of the local narrative. He did not issue a quiet apology or attempt to cancel the grand event. Instead, he doubled down with the breathtaking audacity of a man who genuinely believes he is entirely untouchable. He released an official, highly polished statement to the premier local newspaper and the dominant regional news networks. He proudly declared that the annual Christmas Eve gala at the historic estate would proceed exactly as planned, and it would be significantly grander than ever before. He masterfully spun the chaos of the morning into a triumphant narrative of family resilience. He publicly assured his wealthy peers that the Ross legacy could never be shaken, especially not by the unfortunate, erratic actions of a deeply unstable, estranged daughter. Beckett, perfectly cast in his role as the loyal, suffering son, took to the television screens to solidify this vicious fiction. At 8:15 in the morning, he sat on the plush beige couch of the most popular local morning talk show. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hair styled to project an image of effortless, responsible maturity. I watched the broadcast on the flat-screen television in my hotel room. My brother looked directly into the camera and delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. He smiled a brave, melancholy smile, speaking softly about the heavy burden of upholding family traditions during difficult emotional times. He told deeply moving, completely fabricated stories about our deep commitment to the local community. He managed to weave my sudden departure into his narrative, framing it as a tragic mental breakdown that the family was handling with profound grace and endless forgiveness. The television hosts practically wept with sympathy. In the span of a 15-minute interview, Beckett successfully transformed himself into a local hero and painted me as a greedy, hysterical villain trying to ruin a charity event for children. Behind the towering iron gates of the estate, however, the reality was a frantic, embarrassing scramble. My sudden withdrawal of all corporate financial guarantees had completely gutted their premium vendor list. Lenora was forced to desperately plug the massive holes with whoever would answer the phone on the day before a major holiday. Because the family had absolutely no liquid cash, she had to rely on cut rate, second-tier suppliers who demanded cheap cash deposits up front. Through the extensive network of local event staff who still quietly communicated with Marin, I received constant, detailed updates of the pathetic patchwork. The internationally renowned catering company was replaced by a generic corporate banquet service. The imported, rare winter orchids I had meticulously sourced were hastily swapped for common, slightly bruised poinsettias bought in bulk from a commercial hardware store. The breathtaking, custom-designed architectural lighting was abandoned, replaced by standard, harsh spotlights that completely washed out the historical details of the grand facade. The result was a fragile, superficial imitation of luxury. From a distance, the estate still looked shiny and impressive, but up close, the seams were completely tearing apart. The entire setup was perfectly symbolic of the Ross family itself. A cheap, desperate illusion desperately masquerading as true, undeniable wealth. The true depths of my father and his audacity, however, were not fully revealed until Marin intercepted a leaked press embargo from a sympathetic contact at the local business journal. I sat at the small glass table in my hotel room, reading the confidential briefing, and a cold, pure fury washed over my entire body. My father was not just pushing forward with the gala to save face. He was planning to use the massive audience of wealthy donors, local politicians, and media representatives to make a monumental, empire-defining announcement. He was going to officially unveil a massive commercial project to expand the historic estate into an exclusive, ultra-luxury boutique resort chain. I stared at the attached digital blueprints and the aggressive financial projections. I recognized every single comma, every structural recommendation, and every single demographic analysis. It was my work. 5 years ago, after I had quietly saved the property from the hurricane debt, I had drafted a massive, highly detailed corporate restructuring plan. I had presented it to him in his study, outlining exactly how he could leverage the historical brand to create a sustainable, legally sound hospitality empire. At the time, he had laughed at me. He had mocked the entire concept, claiming it would cheapen the aristocratic purity of our family name. He had tossed my heavy binder into the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk and told me to stick to paying the utility bills. Now, backed into a fatal financial corner of his own making, he had pulled my discarded binder out of the dark. He was actively rebranding my strategic genius as his own grand visionary masterstroke. He was not just trying to push me entirely out of the family narrative. He intended to steal my intellectual property, claim my vision as his own personal triumph, and use my exact corporate roadmap to cement his fake legacy for the next 50 years. He wanted to wear my brain like a stolen medal of honor. I could have stopped him right then. I could have easily instructed Marin to file the emergency legal injunctions directly with the county courthouse at noon. I could have sent a simple email to the local news stations exposing the forged financial documents and the stolen intellectual property. It would have shut the entire production down hours before the first luxury vehicle even pulled up to the gates. But I deliberately chose not to do that. Stopping him early would only make me look like a bitter, defensive woman trying to actively sabotage his big night. It would allow him to play the victim, to claim that his brilliant vision was tragically cut short by my sudden, jealous interference. I refused to let him control the final act of this play. I wanted him to have his audience. I wanted him to gather every single person he needed to impress into that grand, echoing ballroom. I wanted him to inflate his massive ego to the absolute bursting point. I wanted him to stand under the bright stage lights, utterly convinced that he had successfully outsmarted everyone, especially me. My hotel room quickly transformed into a highly efficient, heavily fortified legal war room. Marin Holt was joined by 3 senior corporate litigators from the Bellwether House Collective. We spent the entire afternoon meticulously preparing the absolute destruction of Declan Ross. We compiled flawless, undeniable evidence packets. We included the digitized property deeds, proving my holding company held the absolute preservation lien. We attached the verified forensic accounting reports, detailing his illegal diversion of charity funds for his private lake house. And most importantly, we included the heavily documented proof of his massive commercial fraud, highlighting the exact locations where he had illegally forged my corporate electronic signature on the toxic bank loans. We did not print these documents to hand them out like cheap flyers. Marin and the Bellwether legal team built a secure, automated digital distribution list. They input the private email addresses of every single major philanthropic donor, every bank executive, and every media representative who was confirmed to attend the evening gala. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense. A tight, vibrating wire stretched to the absolute limit. The Bellwether lawyers sat around the table, syncing their encrypted laptops, watching the digital clock quietly tick toward the evening. We were hanging the entire audience in a state of suspended, agonizing breath. I was not just going to shut down a party, I was going to turn his carefully constructed, incredibly expensive stage into a brutal, highly public courtroom. I was going to let him step up to the polished wooden podium, raise his hands to welcome his adoring crowd, and then I was going to drop the absolute crushing weight of the truth directly onto his head. By the late afternoon of the 24th of December, the vicious local media cycle had completely swallowed my father and his carefully crafted narrative, regurgitating it as absolute, undeniable fact across the entire city. I sat in the complete quiet of my hotel room, watching the aggressive digital assassination of my own character unfold in real time on my laptop screen. The premier local society blogs and the wealthy daytime news broadcasts painted a remarkably consistent, devastating portrait of me. I was universally labeled as the cold, calculating, and deeply ungrateful spinster daughter. They insisted I was a woman entirely obsessed with corporate ledger balances, yet completely devoid of a functioning human heart. The wealthy commentators claimed my financial success was not born of intelligence, but was a direct result of a ruthless, sociopathic nature that made me incredibly jealous of my own flesh and blood. While I remained completely silent, refusing to feed the chaotic news cycle, my younger brother was busy engineering the absolute masterpiece of his parasitic public relations career. During the hastily assembled afternoon preview reception for the evening gala, surrounded by local reporters and the cheap second-tier floral arrangements Lenora had frantically secured, Beckett orchestrated a flawless spectacle. He dropped to one knee right in the middle of the grand foyer. He pulled a massive diamond ring from his tailored velvet pocket and proposed to his heavily followed influencer girlfriend. The breathless, tear-filled video was instantly uploaded to every major social platform. The collective internet absolutely swooned. The digital comment sections overflowed with aggressive declarations of support for the brave, loving Ross family who were so tragically victimized by their cruel, unstable sister right before the holidays. Beckett successfully weaponized romance to completely blind the entire public to their impending financial collapse. My phone vibrated sharply against the glass surface of the table, breaking my concentration. It was a direct text message from my father. There was no desperate plea for a secret negotiation to save his estate. There was absolutely no trace of fear regarding the massive commercial fraud he had committed using my stolen corporate identity. The message contained exactly 10 words, typed with the absolute arrogance of a man who firmly believed he had already won the war. He wrote that I was always a temporary phase, never the future. I stared at the glowing letters on the screen for a long, quiet time. Any ordinary daughter might have collapsed under the sheer, concentrated cruelty of that single sentence. It was a perfectly aimed weapon, designed to completely obliterate my sense of self-worth and force me into permanent submission. Instead, those 10 words acted as a perfect, freezing anesthetic. They sliced away the very last microscopic fiber of hesitation left inside my chest. He had officially handed me the absolute permission to destroy him without carrying a single ounce of lingering guilt. A sudden sharp knock at my heavy hotel room door shattered the heavy silence. I walked over and opened it to find Inez standing in the dim hallway. The older woman looked profoundly exhausted. Her shoulders slumped beneath her heavy winter coat, but her dark eyes were burning with a fierce, undeniable determination. Before leaving the estate grounds for good that morning, she had returned to her small staff quarters in the carriage house to pack her personal belongings. While taking down an old, heavy-framed photograph of the estate from the late 1990s, the brittle wooden backing had suddenly split completely open. She reached into her deep pocket and handed me a folded, heavily yellowed legal document that had been perfectly sealed inside the hidden compartment for over 2 decades. I thanked her quietly, locked the door, and sat back down on the edge of the bed. I carefully unfolded the stiff, dry paper. It was a heavily notarized, legally binding amendment to the original Ross family master trust. It was drafted and signed by my mother, Elaine, just 2 short months before her terminal illness finally took her life. I read the archaic legal phrasing, my heart pounding a slow, incredibly heavy rhythm against my ribs. The document contained a highly specific, undeniable contingency clause. It explicitly mandated that if the ancestral estate ever fell into severe financial distress and required external capital from a family member to avoid commercial foreclosure, the individual who provided that massive capital would immediately be granted absolute priority control over the physical property and all associated legacy trusts. This faded piece of paper did not magically grant me the legal authority to seize the massive estate tonight. I had already secured that absolute terrifying power through my own meticulous corporate structuring and the toxic debts I had quietly purchased years ago. The true earth-shattering power of this hidden document was entirely moral. It was the final missing puzzle piece of my mother and her true legacy. She had known exactly what kind of vain, destructive men she was leaving me alone with. She knew with absolute certainty that they would eventually drain the family coffers dry to feed their massive, insatiable egos. She had actively tried to build a secret legal fortress to protect me from their relentless financial exploitation. She simply ran out of physical time on Earth to tell me it existed. Holding that fragile paper, the very last shadow of doubt completely vanished from my mind. I finally realized my mother never intended for me to serve as a silent, suffering shadow, supporting the fragile pride of the Ross men. She never wanted me to buy their love with my endless utility. She wanted me to own the very ground they stood on. She wanted me to be the undisputed master of my own fate. I picked up my phone and immediately dialed the direct line of the chief executive officer of the Bellwether House Collective. I told her the core of our massive real estate agreement remained entirely intact, but I was aggressively adding one final, strictly non-negotiable condition to the corporate transition of the property. When the estate was officially transferred into their commercial portfolio, the Ross family name had to be completely and permanently scrubbed from every single inch of the property. The Grand Mansion would be entirely renamed. Furthermore, I demanded that a permanent, fully funded educational endowment be established using exactly 25% of the annual operational profits of their new luxury retreat. This massive endowment would exclusively fund full academic scholarships for young women pursuing advanced degrees in corporate crisis management. I demanded that the very profession my family had mocked, belittled, and completely despised become the permanent, heavily celebrated legacy of the historical building they loved far more than they ever loved me. The powerful executive on the other end of the line did not hesitate for a single second. She agreed instantly, her voice thick with fierce, undeniable respect for the sheer brutality of the demand. The harsh winter sun finally sank completely below the horizon, plunging the harbor into absolute darkness and officially signaling the beginning of Christmas Eve. I walked into the small bathroom and began to prepare for the grand gala. I did not summon a team of expensive stylists. I did not bother with elaborate, complicated makeup meant to artificially soften my sharp features. I opened my small canvas travel bag and pulled out a single, perfectly tailored, long-sleeved black dress. The heavy fabric was austere and completely devoid of any shiny festive embellishments. It was not a dress designed for celebrating a joyous holiday season. It was a dress specifically designed for attending an execution. I stood motionless in front of the full-length mirror. My neck and my wrists were entirely bare. I deliberately chose not to wear a single piece of the heavy, antique diamond jewelry my father had occasionally gifted me over the years. Those diamonds were just shiny collars meant to keep me quietly compliant. I absolutely refused to carry a single ounce of their fake, borrowed prestige on my body tonight. I gathered my heavy black leather portfolio. It contained the irrefutable forensic evidence of the massive commercial fraud, the holding company property deeds, and the trust amendment. I placed the brittle, folded Christmas letter from my mother safely inside the inner breast pocket of my dark winter coat. Pressing the fragile paper directly over my beating heart, I checked my silver watch. It was exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. The wealthiest, most influential guests in the city would be arriving at the grand iron gates right now. They would be handing their expensive fur coats to the rented staff, entirely oblivious to the massive financial bomb resting quietly beneath their designer shoes. I picked up my phone and my room keys. The reflection staring back at me in the glass was no longer a desperate daughter seeking a permanent seat at a dining table that repeatedly rejected her. The woman in the mirror was a cold, incredibly precise instrument of total ruin. I was not going back to the grand estate to ask for their delayed recognition or to demand a pathetic, forced apology. I was going to the ballroom to permanently terminate a fraudulent dynasty. I turned off the hotel room lights, letting the heavy darkness swallow the space, and walked out the door. Christmas Eve descended upon the city of Charleston with a biting, crystal-clear cold that made the stars look like sharp shards of broken glass. I sat in the back of a rented black town car as we approached the heavy iron gates of the estate at precisely 8:45 in the evening. The sweeping circular driveway was completely choked with a slow-moving, glittering river of imported luxury vehicles. Wren Hall looked absolutely magnificent from a distance, bathed in a sea of warm, artificial amber light that made the towering white columns glow against the dark night sky. The hired valets were sprinting frantically across the freezing gravel, their breath puffing in white clouds. Local press photographers clustered eagerly near the grand stone steps, their camera flashes exploding like tiny bursts of lightning. A 12-piece jazz orchestra was set up on the sweeping veranda, playing their brass instruments so loudly that the cheerful holiday music felt almost violent. It was a brilliant, deafening wall of sound specifically designed to drown out the distinct, metallic scent of total desperation clinging to the walls of the estate. I stepped through the massive front doors and immediately felt the heavy, suffocating heat of 500 wealthy bodies crammed into the grand foyer and the adjoining ballroom. The air was incredibly thick with the smell of expensive French perfume, roasting meats, and the sharp tang of cheap champagne that Lenora had desperately ordered at the last minute to replace my canceled vintage supply. Every single detail in the room was polished to a blinding shine, but to my trained eyes, the entire production looked incredibly fragile, stretched tight like a thin balloon right before it violently bursts. My father was holding court near the towering, heavily decorated spruce tree in the center of the room. He walked among the elite guests as if the catastrophic financial hemorrhaging of the morning had never happened. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo. He held a crystal flute in his right hand, gesturing expansively as he spoke to a tight circle of the most powerful banking executives and philanthropic donors in the state. He was actively spinning his masterful, tragic narrative. I could see the practiced, solemn shake of his head as he undoubtedly recounted the terrible burden of a family overcoming sudden, tragic internal challenges. He was reducing my entire existence, my decades of silent, agonizing sacrifice, to a shameful, whispered footnote in his grand, heroic journey. Across the room, Beckett was thoroughly basking in the glowing admiration of the younger socialites. He played the part of the deeply wounded but incredibly resilient son to absolute perfection. He smiled bravely, accepting gentle pats on the shoulder and sympathetic murmurs from wealthy people who had previously doubted his character. His morning television performance and his incredibly calculated afternoon marriage proposal had worked flawlessly. The entire room had swallowed his toxic fiction without chewing. They looked at him with absolute adoration, completely unaware that his luxury vehicle was currently locked by the bank and his credit cards were entirely frozen. I did not burst into the room shouting. I did not cause a dramatic, hysterical scene at the coat check. I walked into the crowded ballroom with the slow, measured, completely silent pace of a predator entering a locked cage. I was not alone. Flanking my right side was Maren Holt, my lawyer, carrying her heavy leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. On my left walked the impeccably dressed chief executive officer of the Bellwether House Collective. A step behind us was a senior forensic auditor from the private accounting firm, his face entirely blank, his hands clutching a thick, locked digital tablet. We did not look like guests arriving late to a festive holiday party. We looked exactly like a corporate execution squad, arriving for a scheduled appointment. The effect of our silent arrival was immediate and profound. The loud, boisterous laughter near the entrance suddenly died. The heavy silence spread through the massive room like dark ink bleeding into a glass of clear water. A rapidly swelling wave of furious whispers rippled through the sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits. Heads turned sharply. People naturally parted to create a wide, clear path for us as we walked slowly toward the back of the room. I could hear the muttered speculation from the wealthy guests as we passed them. A few naive souls whispered that I had finally broken down and come to beg for my rightful place back in the family. Others eagerly predicted a massive, screaming shouting match. Not a single person in that glittering, arrogant room possessed the imagination to guess the terrifying truth. They did not know I was the undisputed legal owner walking in to personally oversee a permanent eviction. From his elevated position near the front of the room, my father finally spotted me. For a fraction of a second, his perfectly practiced smile slipped, revealing a flash of genuine, jagged annoyance. But the panic quickly vanished, immediately replaced by a thick, impenetrable layer of absolute confidence. He straightened his posture and looked at me with deep, chilling condescension. In his mind, the game was already over. The wealthy guests were completely captivated. The local media was rolling their cameras, and the grand stage was securely set. He firmly believed it was far too late for me to cause any meaningful damage. He thought his sheer charisma and the heavy momentum of the expensive evening would easily crush whatever pathetic, last-minute protest I had brought with me. The jazz band suddenly stopped playing, the final brass notes echoing loudly into the high-painted ceiling. My father stepped up to the polished mahogany podium positioned directly under the massive crystal chandelier. He tapped the microphone, and the amplified sound commanded the absolute attention of the entire ballroom. The room went completely still. He began the most important, desperate speech of his entire life. His voice boomed through the speakers, rich, commanding, and dripping with false humility. He officially announced the launch of his visionary new expansion fund. He spoke grandly of transforming the historic estate into a premier luxury resort destination. He detailed the exact demographic targets, the precise revenue projections, and the highly innovative architectural upgrades. I stood in the shadows at the back of the room, listening to the words leaving his mouth, and a cold wave of pure disgust washed over me. He was reciting, almost word for word, the exact corporate strategic risk and recovery plan I had authored and handed to him 5 long years ago. He was actively stealing my brain trust right in front of my face, presenting my structural genius as his own brilliant salvation. He was trying to push me out of the family while simultaneously using my intellect to build his golden parachute. He raised his voice, building the speech to a dramatic, sweeping crescendo. He spoke passionately about the unyielding, unbreakable spirit of the Ross family. He confidently assured the massive crowd of wealthy investors that no amount of sudden adversity, and certainly no tragic internal betrayals, could ever stop their glorious upward trajectory. He spoke as if reality was entirely subjective. He genuinely believed that if he just spoke eloquently enough under the bright stage lights, the forged electronic signatures, the toxic commercial bank loans, and the stolen charity funds would magically disappear into the cold winter night. He thought his beautiful, expensive lies were infinitely stronger than my cold, ugly truth. The speech reached its final, triumphant peak. Uniformed waiters moved rapidly through the dense crowd, handing out freshly filled glasses of champagne for the grand holiday toast. Marin silently handed me a slender glass, her eyes locked sharply onto the stage. My father raised his crystal flute high into the air, the bright stage lights catching the expensive glass and making it sparkle brilliantly. He projected his voice to the very back of the room, staring directly into my eyes over the heads of 500 people. He invited the entire room to raise their glasses and drink to the absolute, unwavering power of loyalty in the family. The crowd eagerly raised their drinks, a loud chorus of polite murmurs echoing his sentiment. I stood completely still at the back of the room. My face was a smooth, emotionless mask of cold stone. I looked right back at the arrogant man who had stolen my money, my professional name, and my youth. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my right hand and placed my completely full champagne glass onto a nearby silver tray. The heavy glass hit the metal with a sharp, definitive clink that cut through the polite murmurs like a gunshot. It was the absolute, undeniable signal. The grand, beautiful dream of the Ross family was officially over, and the brutal reckoning had finally arrived. The thunderous applause following the grand toast of my father had barely begun to echo off the high-painted ceiling when Marin Holt made her move. She bypassed the hired audiovisual technicians entirely, stepping directly to the master control console hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains near the edge of the stage. She did not ask for permission. She simply plugged her encrypted drive into the primary server and pressed a single button. Behind my father, the massive digital projection screen that had been displaying his beautiful fabricated architectural renderings suddenly went completely black. A split second later, it flared back to life with a blinding white light. The image projected was not a luxury resort. It was a stark, highly detailed financial flowchart. It was accompanied by massive, time-stamped legal documents bearing undeniable county registry seals. The polite applause in the ballroom abruptly died, replaced by a wave of sharp gasps and intense, confused murmurs. My father turned around, his confident smile freezing permanently onto his face as he stared up at the 50-foot projection of his own hidden debt. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. I did not run. My hands were perfectly steady. I climbed the short wooden stairs to the stage. My father took a frantic step backward, his eyes darting between me and the massive screen. completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent intrusion of reality. I stepped up to the polished mahogany podium and adjusted the microphone. I did not scream. I did not let a single ounce of anger bleed into my tone. I spoke in a voice so incredibly quiet and calm that the entire room had to hold their collective breath just to hear me. I looked out at the sea of wealthy donors and said that if the Ross family truly wants to talk about loyalty, we should probably start with the truth of exactly who paid for it. I gestured to the massive screen. I methodically explained the intricate financial structure that had saved the estate from total bankruptcy 7 years ago. I revealed the absolute legal control held by my private holding company. I laid bare every single mortgage payment, every cleared property tax, and every hidden settlement that had kept their glorious illusion alive. I provided irrefutable proof that the man standing on the stage had absolutely zero legal authority to develop the land, because he did not even own the dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. The collective shock in the room was palpable, but the true devastating blow was yet to come. Marin advanced the slides to the next sequence. The screen now displayed the fraudulent commercial loan applications and the heavily altered charity invoices. Right there, magnified 100 times for the absolute wealthiest people in Charleston to see, was the perfect digital forgery of my corporate electronic signature. I looked directly at the hospital board members and the Arts Foundation directors sitting in the front row. I informed them, with chilling clarity, that the charitable foundation they had so generously funded was currently under an active, aggressive investigation for massive financial misappropriation. I watched as leather checkbooks were literally shoved back into designer purses. The flow of new donations completely froze right there in the middle of the grand ballroom. Suddenly, Beckett lunged up the stage stairs. His face flushed a deep, ugly red. He tried to grab the microphone from my hand, his polished public persona entirely shattering into pieces. He desperately attempted to shout that I was lying, that I was a sick, vindictive woman trying to ruin his beautiful life. I stepped back, easily avoiding his grasping hands, and I tore away the very last piece of his carefully constructed mask. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice cutting sharply through his frantic shouting. I told the room exactly how my brother funded his lavish, inspiring public life. I detailed how he used the family charity events solely to build his own personal brand and secure his elite social standing, while relentlessly pushing every single one of his exorbitant private expenses onto the operational ledger that I was secretly carrying on my back. I told his beautiful, weeping fiancée exactly who had paid for the massive diamond ring currently sitting on her finger. Beckett stopped moving entirely, his jaw dropping as the room stared at him with absolute, unvarnished disgust. Then, the chief executive officer of the Bellwether House Collective stepped out of the shadows and joined me on the stage. She did not use a microphone. Her commanding voice projected perfectly across the silent room. She formally announced that due to the severe, highly documented financial breaches and the active commercial fraud, the prearranged transfer agreement had been fully triggered. She informed the glittering, elite crowd that they were currently standing inside a property that was no longer legally associated with the Ross name. The grand estate was officially the property of her collective. For the very first time in my entire life, I saw my father experience genuine, unadulterated terror. The powerful, commanding patriarch was entirely gone. Standing before me was just a small, exhausted old man who had finally run out of other people to exploit. The reality of his complete social and financial destruction crushed the breath right out of his lungs. He stumbled forward, ignoring the staring crowd, and grabbed my forearm. His grip was weak and trembling. He looked into my eyes, shedding his massive pride entirely, and begged me in a desperate, broken whisper not to do this to him in front of all his friends. I looked down at the hand holding my arm. I thought about the thousands of days I had spent desperately hoping he would look at me with even a fraction of the intensity he currently possessed. I felt absolutely nothing. No hatred, no sorrow, no triumph. Just a profound, sweeping emptiness that felt remarkably like freedom. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. I responded to him using the exact same tone he had used to dismiss me for my entire adult life. It was a tone completely devoid of malice, but absolutely resolute. I reached into the pocket of my black coat. I pulled out the heavy antique brass key to the front doors of the estate. I placed it directly onto the wooden podium in front of him. Next to the key, I placed a crisp, folded copy of the exact same ledger I had pinned to the kitchen refrigerator the night before. But I had added one final, handwritten line to the bottom of the page. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him to read it. He looked down at the paper, his lips trembling as he read the words silently. I had written that I vanished, and the grand lie vanished right along with me. I turned my back on Declan Ross, stepped off the stage, and walked out of the grand ballroom. The crowd parted silently to let me pass, no longer looking at me as an outcast, but as the undeniable architect of a total empire collapse. I walked out the heavy front doors, stepping into the freezing, beautiful winter night, and I never looked back at that house again. Months passed, and the harsh winter finally melted into a bright, humid Charleston spring. True to our contract, the Bellwether House Collective aggressively scrubbed the Ross legacy from the property. The grand estate was officially renamed the Elaine Winter Leadership Center, honoring the mother who had tried to save me. The towering iron gates no longer welcomed corrupt bankers and arrogant socialites. Instead, the sweeping lawns and the beautifully renovated boardrooms were filled with brilliant, fiercely determined young women. They were attending crisis management seminars and utilizing the massive scholarship funds generated by the very walls that had once kept me entirely invisible. As for my father and my brother, the fallout was absolute. The local media tore them apart with the exact same vicious enthusiasm they had previously reserved for me. The massive charity fraud triggered federal audits, completely bankrupting whatever pitiful hidden accounts my father had left. Beckett was abandoned by his wealthy friends and his influencer fiancé the exact moment his platinum credit cards stopped working. They were forced to leave the city, fading entirely into the obscure, uncomfortable reality of the working class they had always so deeply despised. I did not spend my days gloating over their ruin. I returned to my corporate work, operating my company with a renewed, impenetrable peace. The bitter resentment that had poisoned my blood for decades was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, mature clarity. I realized that the ultimate conclusion to this story was not merely about me actively destroying the men who hurt me. It was about something far more profound. Sometimes, the absolute greatest, most devastating gift you can possibly give to the people who consistently took you for granted is to simply walk away. The ultimate revenge is stepping out of the dark, allowing them to finally live a single day without your exhausted shoulders holding up their entire world, and watching gravity do the rest of the work. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below telling me exactly where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.